mysteries of eternity, problem that every human being has faced and must face in the course of his existence. And it is interesting to realize that there are a number of remarkable interpretations of this phenomenon, which we call death. So in many cases, the idea has been that the afterlife was simply an extension of physical existence into an invisible realm. This was the idea of the Chinese emperor, who had clay copies of his court made in life-size figures, standing in rows to serve him in the afterlife. Now, he did not believe that those concrete figures were going to serve him, but he believed in a spiritual mystery involved, that after he passed into the other world, these concrete and stone figures would be living, that they would be alive and full size and would serve him, and that he was merely moving his court from the visible to the invisible side of life. Now in Egypt a similar practice was also followed, but with more symbolism involved. The afterlife of the Egyptians, the Elysian fields, or the plains of Amentet, were a beautiful facsimile of Egypt. The same grounds, the same beautiful river, the wonderful people, the palaces, the temples, and all the makeup of a tremendous metropolitan Egyptian super city. At that time also, the pharaoh was buried, and other nobles with similar expositions. He was buried with miniature figures of all of his retinue, his court, and all of the valuable things that he needed to continue his life in the tomb. The afterlife of the Egyptian was in an underworld, ruled over by the great deity Osiris. And this great deity, judging the quick and the dead, ruled over a wonderful realm beneath the earth that men could not see, but to which human beings passed after the physical decease. In some of the old manuscripts, various animals, such as family pets, were included among the figures that came with him into the afterlife. Everywhere we find evidences of the belief that the invisible world to which we pass and from which we came has a more or less physical appearance that is similar to the world that we know. It was not until comparatively late in the development of human thinking that the idea of heaven and hell as we think of it today came into existence. Most of antiquity had really no concept of hell. They did not have any of that Dantesque mystery that we find in the beautiful but morbid paintings of Gustave Doré. To the ancient people, hell was more or less of a shadow. They did not believe they were bad enough to deserve it in the first place, and they were perfectly willing to face a world that went on into a realm beyond ours. The Greeks, for many centuries, believed that there was no afterlife except in the ghost world. The ghosts of the dead continued forever. This did not meet with the approval of minds such as Pythagoras and Plato and Aristotle, and modification began at a comparatively early date. Among the Egyptians and Phoenicians, the invisible world was so visible and so real that you continued in your various pursuits as you had lived them in life. If you had plowed a field while alive, you would have a field to plow in the afterlife. And there is one story about a very honest moneylender who had never cheated those who borrowed from him. He was a very good man. So when he died, they gave him a special privilege. in the afterlife. He could set up his money tables by the gates of heaven and lend money to anyone coming in who wanted it. And he always was meticulously honest. And it was the honesty, and not his profession, that earned him this respect. Then we have another group of people who believe, as many primitive people do, including a number on the Western Hemisphere, that death is a birth into the afterlife. And many ancient peoples buried the dead in embryo position, so that the earth became the womb of the second birth. We find tombs of this kind on all the continents. We also have evidences that many of those who lived before us, at least, had a consciousness of being able to travel in the afterlife while they still lived. This is true of the American Indians of the Southwest. It was also true of the Irish. The Irish perfectly believed that certain of their sages and saints could go into the afterlife, and that they would be welcomed there, and they could bring back messages for those who needed guidance or assistance. It was not until comparatively late that the death took on the terrible appearance with which we have associated with. It was not regarded by the ancients as a misfortune. It was regarded as a simple transference of conditions. The individual did not change greatly by the transition, but he functioned in a different dimension of life. And here he had to grow and learn and grow up again and go to school in some way to learn his way around this new realm. Now, psychics in all parts of the world have given us traditions about this. Andrew Jackson Davis, the seer of Poughkeepsie, one of America's most prominent early spiritualists, gave what he called a picture, the Summerland. This Summerland was a beautiful countryside, and it was an invisible pasture field with flowers and trees where individuals lived out a very beautiful life if they had earned such a record. If they had made some mistakes and so forth, they received some punishments, but ultimately were accepted into the world of eternal light, eternal summer, eternal happiness. So this was one psychic belief, and he wrote the book, The Stellar Key to the Summerland. Another psychic of great fame was Baron Emanuel Swedenborg, who was one of the greatest scientists of the Scandinavian countries. He was also in his later years a psychic and had many beliefs concerning the conditions of the afterlife. He left very detailed accounts of conditions beyond the grave, which very well resembled conditions in a well-run Swedish state. And among other things, in Swedenborg's viewpoints, any young ladies who happened to arrive in this afterworld were chaperoned to make sure that everything retained its proper proprieties. Now, we have constantly had psychics who have something to say about this type of thing, but have been strangely uncertain themselves. We very seldom have a psychic exposition in which the emphasis is how things are over there. We hear about famous people coming back to converse with the living, but it does not seem that any answers that they give clear the problem of life after death. The answers accept the problem, but they do not clear the path or the way or the circumstances involved in the transition. This seems to have been generally neglected throughout almost all psychic experiences. Jacob Bellamy, the German mystic, had visions of the afterlife. His visions of this were very much based upon the visions of Dionysius Areopagus, the early Christian father. These dreams and visions represented a luminous universe, with hierarchies representing the planets and the zodiacs. This luminous world was a world of light, of color, vibration, and was a very pleasant place. But what you did do when you get there, Amy didn't tell us. All it expressed was the fact that it was a vision of things to be, such as the visions of the Gnostics and the Albigensians and the Manichaeans and many others. Each religion of the world has its own concept of paradise, where it is and what it is. There seems to be very little, however, detailed study of the subject. Now, let's go back to our own problem here. Supposing we assume for a moment at least that this world that we live in now can be considered as a basic example of something, an example that it is hard to deny, an example which might tell us a lot if we consider it carefully. We know that life here begins with pain, begins with trouble, that most existence that we have here passes through stages of troubles and infirmities, that it only lasts for a certain length of time, and then in one way or another we depart. But there are a lot of things to think about in this. Why is this world, which was given to us according to Scripture as a garden, why did it get to be so troubled? Why is this planet that presumably was invented, devised, or created for the purpose of allowing or enabling human souls to grow? Why has it been in trouble since the very beginning? Why has this growth consisted principally of war and crime? Why does everyone who comes into this world apparently come into a sphere of sickness, disease, sorrow, and death? Is this part of a plan, or is this something that shouldn't be but got to be from other causes? Let us assume for a moment that the person living in this world is living in a highly conditioned condition, which he has probably, in one way or another, caused for himself. In other words, it was not intended that birth should be a problem of great pain, that the growing up and living through the various intensities of life would be an endless cause of suffering and mental anguish, or that sickness would dominate the careers of many, and that very often both birth and death were painful experiences. Is this due to the fact that such was nature's intent? Or is it due to the fact that humanity, in one way or another, has tried to take over nature, has tried to rule nature rather than obey it, has tried to create its own laws, and has set up a human autocracy in the midst of a divine one? It seems as though there is much to indicate that the troubles that we have are mostly not the result of the way nature put things together, but the way that we have readjusted and dodged them from one condition to another. We have juggled these factors, and we have mixed them up so badly that we have ended up with crime and war. Suppose, for example, the human being had not made these mistakes. Supposing he had obeyed the laws of life as they were given to him and revealed again and again through his sacred writings and the wisdom of his sages, we would say the human being was born in peace and in consolation, that there was no back heredity, there were no deformities, there was no hereditary sickness, disease, emotional incompatibilities, broken homes, from which the individual had to come. Suppose that was eliminated. The result would be a very different type of person. A person not necessarily wise, but a person endowed with the natural gift of the world in which he lives. He would be endowed with the simple fact that he could exist happily and comfortably, and for the most part in good health. Now, most of our problems probably arise basically from bad health. We become toxic or disturbed emotionally. We gain all kinds of problems which we assemble and struggle with, and we find that this span of 60, 70, 80, 90 years to which we pass is largely a confusion caused by ourselves. And two aspects of that confusion that come into focus with us at the moment are, due to this confusion, birth is painful. And due to this same condition, death is painful. Now, it's not necessarily true that that was what was intended, but that is what we have done about it. We have taken natural laws and so misused them, distorted them, and ignored them, that we have brought down upon ourselves a mass of troubles which were not necessary and which were not intended by nature. Nature did not intend man to come into a world of miseries, suffer, and depart in pain. These conditions are due to human action and thought. We are now fighting in our communities a whole series of such problems. We are fighting narcotics addiction, alcoholism, tobacco addiction. We are fighting all kinds of laws and rules relating to wealth, power, and ambition. We have set all of our goals on the physical plane of life. We have taken this world, which might have been a very happy playground, and turned it into an infirmary and a vast graveyard. This is not what nature intended. This is not what man was put together for. This is not the experience he was supposed to be ready to receive. It was assumed that he would come to this world to gradually come to glorify the Creator and the creation. Instead of that, he has come in the end to damn them both. So we have here a false beginning. And with a false beginning, we also have to go back a ways, because this false beginning is of the sins of the fathers under the fifth and sixth generation. We are all here with infirmities that have come from the misdeeds of our ancestors, and these we carefully pass on to our descendants. The result is that health is almost imaginary, but we are beginning to realize more of its importance. And in the last 50 years, we have done more thinking about health, probably, than any time in history. We may almost say that primitive mankind didn't think about it because it didn't do anything to hurt itself, primarily. It lived a very simple life. It had to defend itself against the terrors of the night and things of this nature, but for the most part, it lived a very simple existence. As we came to be more and more complicated, we became sicker and sicker. We gradually also then developed institutions to correct these sicknesses that we had created. But because we created them within ourselves and not in the body, the physician is not always successful. We are not able to cure the sins of the spirits with pills and shots. The entire part of the individual that is important to us at the moment is that which we can't see. It is the invisible overself that really runs the physical body. This overself, however, is so neglected by most people that the body is without adequate leadership. It is as though a very nice government were set up with a proper representative, and in the course of time a bunch of gangsters took it over. And these gangsters are our selfishness and our deceits and our stupidity and our rejection of common sense. All these together have ruined what might have been a pretty good place to live. Now we're gradually beginning to be a little more aware of this. It is dawning upon us that it's possible that all these misfortunes are not necessary, that they were not in the original archetype, but have been the result of a vicious misinterpretation or distortion of the common facts of good nature and common sense. So we say to ourselves, suppose we clean this up. We might then have a world in which the human being would be decently born, with comparatively little pain to the parent, a world in which they would grow up gradually, and education would be suitable and adequate to their needs, and not to try to adjust them to a hopeless situation. We are educated more or less to try and lengthen our survival in a situation that never should have existed in the first place. And true education, a true realization of our real purpose and our real potential, hasn't a chance. It wouldn't even be mentioned because it would interfere with some monopoly that is flourishing, for the moment at least. So we have no way of, at the moment, correcting some of these problems. But they are correctable. They should never have existed. And they represent a very vicious misuse of an inheritance which came from the highest possible source, truth. So we go along through the years and we get sick. And we get tired. And we get tempted. And one by one we fall into some form of disease or displeasure which begins to corrupt our natures. And so the body, which probably has a potential strength of at least close to a century, may give out any pair along the line, because simply it does not have the strength with which it was intended to be endowed. Now, this doesn't mean that every person in trouble has lived a riotous life, but behind every person may be several generations of the lawless. And many a proud family now, which is also in trouble, that has among its ancestors 2 or 3 that were hung from the yardarm, that were actually pirates of the worst. So we bring with us a body which is more or less not a blessed gift in the beginning, the way it is now, though the best can be done under the circumstances. But this body comes in with a great many deficiencies that are due to the ancestral pattern and the whole line of the descent of humanity. The human generation, regeneration problem has been going on for ages. And we are now well along in a platform of misunderstandings and ignorance. So we come here with what we have. And being not too well, we begin to look over the situation to see if we can find something to do about it. So we get a little help from some new kinds of people that come up who are beginning to teach the importance of nature in remedying the defects of human beings. We begin to think of exercise and diet and living a little cleaner life and refraining from some of the noxious and toxic situations that are now gaining fame and distinction. But the moment we try to improve, we hit upon some pattern where someone is making a good profit by our not improving, and then we have difficulties again. In other words, to become honest is desperately dangerous. It becomes an interference with the rights of other people to do to us anything they feel like doing, which may or may not be particularly constructive. So on we go, and we learn a little as we go along, and we try to improve life, but we come gradually towards the end of the endurance of a body that has been seriously misused. At that time, there is a whole group of terminal illnesses with which we are combating. We are trying desperately to find cures for them, but we don't even dare to suspect that we might find a cause of them that could be corrected. So in the course of time, we come at the end, and we come to the time where there must be a division between the physical body and the metaphysical elements of the personality. We believe in idealistic philosophy and in the higher realms of thinking that the physical body is a kind of carriage, a wagon, in which something rides. That the actual being in the body is not identical with it. If you believe them to be identical, you are a materialist. If you do not believe that they are identical, you are an idealist. And 90% of humanity has been idealistic since the dawn of time. Very few peoples have ever come to maturity who believed that the individual died at the grave. Nearly everyone has had some philosophy of survival. And without this philosophy of survival, there seems to be no incentives to rise above the misfortunes of the present state. In other words, if you're miserable here, but you do the best you can, perhaps somewhere else you're going to get a better chance.
Many nations have also gradually developed the concept of reincarnation as an answer to the infinite problem pattern of growth. It is perfectly obvious that the average person in one body as we see them now in incarnation cannot be perfect. We know definitely that we cannot know everything. We cannot be everything. Certainly we try to have everything, but very few make it. What we really are is growing creatures in a midstream of life. We came from something less and we're growing into something better. And this growth obviously is not completed in one life. The individual who makes a modest gain must be considered